issues of interest to foreign policy, but this particular issue, the autonomous weapon system, for this talk is actually a warm-up to our high-level conference on autonomous weapon system that the Austrian Foreign Ministry is organizing later this month, at the end of April. It's called Humanity at the Crossroads, Autonomous Weapon Systems and the Challenge of Regulation, and we will talk about this in detail later. Before we start our tech diplomacy talk, allow me to briefly explain why the Austrian Foreign Ministry is interested in technology and what we are trying to achieve with our tech diplomacy talks. So, as you all know, emerging and disruptive technologies have become critical factors in international relations at large. When it comes to peace and security, economic and technological competitiveness, and military projection. And this importance has increased over the years. And we feel that's the reason why it's important for us as Foreign Ministry to scale up our capacities in order to better understand the implications of these technologies for international law and international relations, and thus be in a better position to respond to them, both in terms of better leveraging their positive potential while mitigating, addressing the risks. So our as always, what the Austrian Foreign Ministry is doing is our tech diplomacy focus is premised on our traditional foreign policy priority, that is the primacy of international law, particular international humanitarian and human rights law. And what we seek to do here with our tech diplomacy activities is to enhance our profile as a trusted partner in multilateral global governance, but also at the same time support better our Austrian communities, be it business, research, technology, or the science. So these talks help to build our capacity, but also are part of our outreach efforts to the different communities involved. So some housekeeping rules. We have 90 minutes. We'll start off with an introductory remarks by Ambassador Alexander Ment. Then I will ask our esteemed panelists to come up to the stage. We have one panelist online, and we will then dig and dive deeper into the legal, ethical, and security technological dimensions of autonomous weapon systems. And then afterwards, after the inputs of our esteemed panelists, we'll have time for a Q&A. That's the moment where you then have the opportunity for an interactive discussion with our panelists. So let's advance. Now, I have great pleasure in introducing to you Ambassador Alexander Ment. Ambassador Ment is Director of the Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Department of the Austrian Foreign Ministry and President of the June 2022 first meeting of states parties to the TPNW, the Treaty Prohibiting Nuclear Weapons. He has been elected Arms Control Person of the Year 2014. I jokingly say that I'm his biggest fan, but I suppose there are more in the Foreign Ministry. He's a real star in the disarmament and non-proliferation, in particular nuclear weapons community. He wrote an excellent book that you should all read on the Treaty Prohibiting Nuclear Weapons, and he held senior positions in the EU. He was our ambassador, Austria's ambassador in the Political and Security Committee in the EU, but also held senior level positions at the CTBTO and the Austrian Foreign Ministry. Now, with that, I'd like to invite Alexander Ment to give his introduction to us.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for the introduction, which made me blush. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to have this opportunity today to speak to you on the ethics of autonomous weapon systems, which is 10 days before the conference that the Austrian Foreign Ministry organizes that Claudia has mentioned. The title of the conference is Humanity at the Crossroads, Autonomous Weapon Systems and the Challenge of Regulation. So this is going to be a big meeting. We have 130 states that have registered to attend, 800 government representatives and experts from academia, civil society, the military and industry, will gather in Vienna to discuss the profound challenges of the increasing integration of autonomy into weapon systems. And this is, of course, very timely because, first of all, we see these developments right in front of our eyes, and autonomous weapon systems will soon be in the world's military arsenals. It's not, of course, that AI as such should cause alarm. Many developments, as you all know, will be very beneficial for humanity, and also many military applications will be beneficial as well. But in a world where decisions over life and death may soon be made by algorithms and machines, we are forced to rethink what it means for the role and the responsibility of humans when it comes to the use of force when this development happens. So the increased autonomy of weapon systems through integrating artificial intelligence will fundamentally change how armed conflicts are fought in the future. And of course, we see this already in the present, and what role humans will play in them. And some of these changes, as I said, we see already right now. And there are arguments in favor of these weapons, of course. They will be faster, they will likely be more effective, and they may reduce casualty amongst one's own soldiers. And this is why militaries all over the world want to acquire these weapons, and some governments investing significant resources into their development. And some speak already of an AI arms race, which will be hard to stop, especially in times of geopolitical tensions. And others talk about this moment of being as significant as the advent of nuclear weapons, and therefore refer to it as an Oppenheimer moment. But at the same time, autonomous weapons raise profound legal, ethical, and security questions. Human decision-making is indispensable to make legal and moral judgments. International law and international humanitarian law specifically requires an evaluation of proportionality of the use of force and the distinction between combatant and civilians. And such evaluations are necessarily context-specific. How can all possible conflict scenarios be programmed in advance? Who is to be held accountable if something goes wrong? Human responsibility must remain at the center of the law. So the challenges for international humanitarian law, of course, are huge and significant. But the significance of autonomous weapon systems goes far beyond international humanitarian law, because there are crucial ethical issues at stake. What is the role of humans in the use of force? What can we let algorithms do? And what roles and responsibilities must never, on no account, be delegated from humans to machines? What do autonomous weapon systems mean for the concept of law, and for accountability, and for human rights? As I said, humans and their responsibility are at the center of the law. Fundamental ethical concerns are raised when people are processed as data points through sensors and algorithms, and subsequently subjected to physical force. The risk of bias in data sets looms large. We are exactly at the point where these questions are the most pertinent ones. It's morally repugnant and ethically unacceptable to remove human judgment, human empathy, and human accountability from life and death decisions. This risks making wars and armed conflict even more inhumane. The dictates of public conscience need to be discussed in this context. For a future in which machines and algorithms may dominate warfare, we need a strong ethical foundation. So the implications for humanity of crossing the line of fully autonomous weapon systems are grave. Today we are on the cusp of the introduction of autonomous weapon systems at scale. And soon most militaries will upgrade to such systems, and it's not a stretch to predict that autonomous weapon systems will become cheaper and will be used in many conflicts, including by non-state actors. They could become the weapons of choice for terrorists. The security implications are, of course, hard to predict from today's vantage point, but they are likely to be very serious. So the discrepancy between how the technology is driven forward, the speed of it, and the incredible resources behind it, and the multilateral and international efforts to think this through and regulate this development, this discrepancy is absolutely striking. The preventative window to deal with this is also closing. We must ensure meaningful human control over such systems. Avoid systems that we can't understand, that maybe we can't control, we can't predict, and maybe we can't stop. And this makes the arrival of autonomous weapons such a watershed moment for humanity, and it should be discussed much more broadly. In many ways, it is tragic that this incredible progress related to artificial intelligence and consequently also autonomous weapon systems takes place against the backdrop where geopolitics are so bad. And this is why, of course, we have been unable to move internationally forward on the urgent issue of regulation. So at the time when political leadership and international cooperation to deal with such a hugely significant development for humanity as a whole, where this is most urgently needed, leadership is largely lacking, and international cooperation is most difficult to come by due to the breakdown of trust among key players. So we hope at the conference in Vienna to counter this a little bit, to raise awareness for the importance of the issue, to increase political momentum that we need to look for regulations for autonomous weapon systems with urgency. So the key political questions in front of us really are two. What do we need to do to safeguard the role of humans in the use of force in decisions over life and death? And secondly, what can we do and what must we do despite the difficult geopolitical environment to achieve this? So from our vantage point, this is truly a crossroads. That's why we chose the title for the conference. And humanity must be vigilant not to miss the right turn on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gnent. I think you framed the issue and the urgency of our action very, very vividly and impressively. Now I'd like to invite our panelists, Elisabeth Hofdager-Pippern, who is an international law and international security specialist at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt. Would like her to take the seat. And then we have Erich Brehm, who's a computer scientist, AI specialist, expert, and philosopher. And then we have Anja Kaspersen, who joins us online. She's a long-standing disarmament expert, senior in various senior positions, and she's currently now leading the IEEE's work on sensitive technologies. IEEE stands for the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers. It's the world's largest professional association on technology and a great partner of the Austrian Foreign Ministry. So with that, we start our panel and work on the issues at hand. Just push this away. Yes. So, Anja, I hope yes, we see Anja on the screen. Good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us. So, we start with Elisabeth. Elisabeth Hofdager-Pippern is, as I said, an international law expert. She works at the Peace Security Institute Frankfurt in the International Security Research Department, and she specializes in international humanitarian law, human rights, arms control, with a specific focus on emerging technologies and military robotics. Before joining the Frankfurt Peace Institute, she headed the IPRA, the International Panel on the Regulation of Autonomous Weapons, a project funded by the German Federal Foreign Office. And Elizabeth was also a former colleague with us and worked at the Austrian NFA. So Elizabeth will now introduce the issue at hand. She will talk about autonomy in weapon systems and also the legal implications. So the floor is yours. What does international law say with regard to autonomous weapons?
Thank you very much. There should be.
Do we have a presentation? Yes, yes, yes. Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm very happy to be here today, and I think that the discussion about autonomous weapon systems and battlefield AI cannot be more timely for very tragic purposes or tragic reasons. What I'm going to do in the next couple of minutes is I'm going to rush through the concept of autonomy in weapon systems to give you an overview of what we are actually talking about. And then I'm also going to give you some insights into what international law has to say about autonomy in weapon systems. However, I might not be able to answer all your questions, so please feel free to address them and ask them in the Q&A session. Next slide, please, for the very first one. So the definition of autonomous weapon systems has been very present in the past couple of years, and to date, we do not have an official definition of autonomous weapon systems yet. This is very important. However, already in 2016, the International Committee of the Red Cross provided a working definition of autonomous weapon systems. It has also updated this definition in 2021, but we can really basically refer to this definition in order to understand what autonomy in weapon systems actually means and when we're talking about autonomous weapon systems. So what the ICRC basically said was that any weapon system with autonomy in its critical functions that can select and attack targets without human intervention are to be considered autonomous weapon systems. And as you can see, this is a very broad definition of autonomous weapon systems. We have used that in academia and also in various think tanks as a working definition, and various states in the GT have also referred to this definition. However, it gets more tricky when you look at different technologies that might well fit into this definition. What about, for example, pressure-activated mines? What about fire and forget munition? And what about so-called defensive systems? I'm going to talk about all these three technologies throughout the next minutes in order to give you an impression of what we're actually talking about and what we're not so much talking about. So next slide, please. When you talk about the example of mines, they would theoretically fulfill the criteria of an autonomous weapon system because they can actually, when you talk about pressure-activated mines, kind of select and engage targets without any further human input, without the need for a human to intervene or to press a button or whatever. This is why, for example, Palestine, the state of Palestine has proposed that even pressure-activated mines might fall under the definition of an autonomous weapon system. For some, this might be a bit surprising because it doesn't have to do anything with, for example, artificial intelligence. It doesn't really refer to emerging technology in a strictest sense. We have talked about mines for years. Many of them are largely banned. So why should we cover, for example, pressure-activated mines by the definition of an autonomous weapon system? But there are states and parties to the CCW which say, yes, this is true. We need to apply a very broad understanding of autonomous weapon systems. However, states such as the United States argue to the contrary. They have provided an own definition of autonomous weapon system in their very famous regulation 3009 of 2012, updated in 2023. And here they explicitly say their definition, their understanding of autonomy in weapon systems, of an autonomous weapon system, does not cover, for example, mines, which includes, of course, pressure-activated mines or also claymore munition, which basically works with a trap wire. Next slide, please. So this is just one technology that is still open to debate, that you can see what actually autonomy really entails. Another issue that is really relevant is also fire and forget munition. Just to give you a very brief overview. Normally, if you want to attack a military objective, very back in the days, so to say, it was necessary to have visual contact, or it needed to be in line of sight, this military objective, that you can really attack that objective and thereby also comply with humanitarian law inter alia. So sometimes these objectives were, for example, highlighted with a laser, or there was a direct contact with a wire, for example. And then later on, technology changed. And what happened was that so-called fire and forget munition was invented. Humans, they basically tell the system, this is, in this vicinity, there are certain military objectives, and then the munition can, after its launch, after its activation, really kind of narrow it down by using radar or infrared to then identify that target, that specific target. So let's say the human operator says, here in this direction, we do have 5 different military objectives. They're like military tanks, and then they fire and activate that fire and forget munition. And the fire and forget munition can use technology to really say, okay, narrow it down which objective is going to be attacked. So there's also a certain kind of autonomy, certain kind of independence from the human operator involved. However, the United States, but other states also say it's not an autonomous weapon system per se, because humans still predict, still tell the system there are certain military objectives and you need to attack them. And there's this kind of a whole library of different objects that the system can attack. Fire and forget munition is very famous. If you talk about the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, we know that javelins, for example, or Stinger was a very famous weapon systems that were used in this regard and that were sent to used heavily in Ukraine. But they do not necessarily qualify as an autonomous weapon system per se, because still humans predict what kind of military objectives should be attacked. And there's just a so-called, in German we say Nachsteuerungseffekt. So there's a kind of a guidance systems that is applied. Next slide, please. And then we have this very almost never-ending discussion about defensive systems. You know that the discussion about defensive system has been very, I would say, very active in the past years. When we talk about, or in Germany had this discussion, whether Germany should send defensive systems to Ukraine. So they really wanted to kind of narrow down the possibility that they would further add fuel to the already existing conflict. And so Germany was a bit hesitant to send, for example, certain tanks, artillery, or so whatsoever. And so they said, well, just let us focus on defensive systems. But this is not the kind of defensive system we are talking about when we have this discussion about autonomous weapon systems. When we talk about defensive systems in the realm of autonomy weapon systems, we're talking about the Patriot system, we're talking about Phalanx, Iron Dome, the German Schutzsystem, but also so-called sentry weapons. And I'm sure many of you have already heard, of course, the very famous Iron Dome. There is a certain degree of autonomy involved when we talk about defensive systems, because they can also, mostly based on radar signature, identify incoming missiles and then more or less autonomously intercept those missiles. There is a ground. In most cases, such as also in the Patriot system, there is a certain ground control station, so humans are still involved in the operation of these systems. It's not said that there is no human involved and that they're working entirely autonomously, but there's also a certain degree of autonomy involved. I'm not going into details about the Patriot system or Phalanx or Iron Dome, but there is in academia a certain group of scientists, of academics who say, yes, defensive systems such as Iron Dome, even Patriot, Phalanx, or the Schutzsystem, they qualify as autonomous weapon systems. And then we had this discussion in the GGE and so on and so forth, whether a regulation of autonomous weapon systems should include defensive systems. Other states would say, well, we already have them out there. Why regulate them? This would also not be in our interest. The industry would certainly object against this kind of decision to regulate these systems. And other states said, well, then let's just exclude them. Very briefly, just for your own food of thought, if you exclude a certain technology, such as a defensive system, you're going to focus very much on platforms. You're going to talk about the Patriot system, the Phalanx, the Iron Dome. These are all systems and basically all different kinds of platforms. However, on a more abstract level, on a meta level, it is way more important not to focus so much on platforms as such, but to see autonomy in weapon systems as a larger and broader concept. Autonomy can manifest itself at very different levels throughout the military echelon, for example, until it reaches up to the critical functions, where, of course, we can select and engage targets without human intervention. So opponents of this approach said, do not exclude certain weapon systems out of the scope of application of any potential regulation, because then we would start a discussion about specific platforms. And this would be really tricky and really difficult, and states could potentially easily evade regulation by inventing new weapon systems that are not covered. So let's focus on something that is technology agnostic, technology neutral, that really focuses more on the role humans play in the use of force. Next slide, please. This is just a very brief update that the United States has provided also a definition of autonomous weapon systems. Here, I just wanted to give you an impression that autonomy can mean very different things to very different stakeholders. The United States, for example, differentiates between autonomous weapon systems and semi-autonomous weapon systems. We had this very old discussion about human in the loop systems, on the loop, and then out of the loop systems. Just briefly to address, just wanted to address these kind of terminologies that are out there, that you understand that autonomy is something that is really difficult to capture, even for stakeholders who have worked in this area for years now. Next slide, please. Another issue that should be borne in mind is that autonomy weapon systems and autonomous weapon systems themselves, they very often try artificial intelligence, but they are not necessarily intertwined. Why is that the case? We do have technology out there. For example, Israel's IAI-Harpy, which is a loitering munition that works basically on radar signature. So loitering munition, what can loitering munition do? It's an unmanned or uninhabited aerial vehicle that loiters around a certain area for a certain time in a certain predetermined geographical area. And once this kind of loitering munition identifies enemy radar signature, it then lets itself literally fall onto that military object, such as an enemy radar system, and then it can destruct itself by letting itself down. So it's not equipped with, for example, a particular ammunition, but it can self-destruct. So it's also called the kamikaze drones. And here, very often, artificial intelligence was not part of the game. It was very simple radar signature that they were able to identify enemy targets simply by using this kind of very old technology. Of course, throughout the years, Israel has updated loitering munitions, and other providers from Turkey or coming from different other states have also, of course, modernized their arsenals now. And autonomy in weapon systems very often means, of course, artificial intelligence, but it's not necessarily the case. And when you argue that mines are also covered by the term, we see that artificial intelligence so far doesn't play a significant role with regard to mines. Just as a short next slide. Just also something that very briefly about regulatory approaches. I had a very interesting discussion with a French representative 2 or 3 years ago, and when they started to talk about this kind of two-tier approach. So the two-tier approach that you know what when we're talking about regulation, what do we want or where can we go? The two-tier approach basically means that we can prohibit, or states should prohibit, certain autonomous weapon systems. So they are, in any case, crossing red lines, violating humanitarian law, violating human rights law, and so on and so forth. And then there are so-called, this was the idea by France and also later on Germany, and then there are so-called autonomous weapon systems which do not necessarily automatically cross red lines per se, but they raise certain issues, they raise certain questions, and they should be addressed and regulated so that the use of these weapon systems still complies with humanitarian law, with human rights law, with ethical considerations, of course, and also with military considerations. So this is the so-called two-tier approach. Prohibit a certain category of weapons which are absolutely unacceptable, and then regulate all other autonomous weapon systems which still raise significant questions as regards international law, ethical considerations, or even security considerations. I just wanted to mention the idea of France's idea in this regard, because what they actually said was, coming back to this conversation I had, in their proposal, only weapon systems which are able to expand the scope or the so-called library of potential targets by themselves, by using machine learning, only these weapon systems are considered fully autonomous weapon systems. This was also heavily criticized for various reasons. I just wanted to flag that. Next slide, please, and I'm already done. So the last few slides, just what does international law say about autonomous weapon systems? You all know that we have these principles in humanitarian law, the principle of distinction, proportionality in attack, precautions in attack, but also, of course, the obligation to review new weapons, means, and methods of warfare. And just that you know, of course, these principles are primarily enshrined in Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, which also largely reflect customary law. So these are the basic rules that need to be applied and adhered to when using autonomous weapon systems. It is important to focus on the fact that it is humans, the human operators, and of course, states. The human operators are representing states, of course, which are bound by humanitarian law. It's not the machines themselves, of course. This is very important. So really, in our discussion, we need to focus on the fact that we should not anthropomorphize autonomy in weapon systems or technology in general. Next slide, please. Very, very briefly. And what you can also see, you can later, of course, please ask questions about also conflict classification. When you talk about targeting law, we very often forget other issues that are very difficult to address, such as, for example, the obligation not to neutralize enemy combatants, which are hors de combat, so which have, for example, surrendered or which have who have been incapacitated. And I was wondering always how it should ever be possible for a machine to identify someone who has fallen hors de combat, so someone who has surrendered, because I can pretend to have surrendered and then just easily trick that machine into pretending to be someone who doesn't want to fight anymore. Maybe I can raise a white flag, but this is also not common in all cultures. And how should a machine, most importantly, be able to interpret and understand when someone has been heavily incapacitated, because this would mean that the machine would need to interpret behavior, and this is, from a technical perspective, really, really challenging. Yes, I think that I'm running out of time, but as I said, we need to look at it from a broader perspective. Very often we talk about the accountability gap. Maybe that's just one last point I would like to raise. Accountability can mean so many different things for so many different actors and stakeholders. The question of who is responsible needs to be addressed from various legal elements, so to say. We have international law, state responsibility. So states are always responsible if they or their state agents violate international law, including humanitarian law, when using autonomous weapon systems. True that. We're also talking about international criminal law. But please bear in mind that criminal law always applies only in case law has been broken intentionally. This is something that needs to be addressed. And how can we verify if someone has used an autonomous weapon system, for example, killed a civilian intentionally? And then we also have the domestic level, which should not slip under the radar. We have product liability, we have disciplinary systems. So there's a whole area of regulatory approaches. And we should also not forget the European Union, which is also coming closer to kind of having an effect on military AI, even though the EU, of course, has very limited competences from a legal perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. You gave a really broad overview of the questions that have been discussed for the last 10 years or so in the group of governmental experts and before, and in academia, and in particular the legal implications. We will now look into the ethical aspects of autonomous weapon systems, and Erich will talk about these. Let me just briefly give a bit more detailed introduction to Erich Brehm. As I already said, he's a computer scientist, AI expert, and philosopher, currently working on ethical and epistemological questions of artificial intelligence. He held various research positions at the Austrian Research Institute of AI at the MIT, but also teaching positions at the Technical University of Vienna. Currently, he's teaching about digital humanism. And he also has a consultancy for a company. So You combine both technical and philosophical expertise. So what are the ethical implications of autonomous weapons systems? What is at stake for sort of the larger picture for humanity?
Thanks, Claudia. Thanks for the kind invitation and presentation. And thanks also to Elizabeth for potentially explaining why all of this is rather confusing. Not because your talk was confusing, but because the subject matter is confusing, and that justifies having a philosopher that explains either why you should be confused or why it's not. You shouldn't be ashamed of being confused, and I think I'll probably focus on the latter. So the issues which are at stake here are tricky and rather fundamental. Let me just start by saying, I'll talk about ethics, and ethics is not the legality of war. It's a different debate, more important for some, less important for others, so it depends on where you come from. But international humanitarian law as a legal system roots, I think, in an ethical idea, which is the minimization of cruelty. That's really what we're trying to achieve here. And basically, it roots in the recognition that some acts are just too cruel for humanity. They are inhumane. And this is why in international humanitarian law, there is this idea of minimum criteria for aid, for letting civilians flee, for example, for the idea of unacceptable harm, for example, the prohibition of chemical weapons, and the idea that we shouldn't have indiscriminate action, as it was mentioned, for example, with anti-personal landmines. And really, it's a negotiated compromise between, well, two options, both of which are not very good, which is the need for war and minimum harm. So as an ethicist, you're already in a very bad position. It's only bad options, so to speak. Secondly, I'd like to make also an explanatory remark why all of this is probably interesting now is because there are certainly changing characteristics of war. So the very notion of what is a war has been changing, has been undergone change. People are talking about a fluid war. It's no longer as clear as it probably once was. Who are the actors in the war? There is a mix of private and public actors. There is no more classically a declared war. There is this increasing trend to distance, for which we have been prepared, I guess, since at least 15, 20 years, where we were shown images of drones that were described as high precision attacks, criticized by some as depicting war as a game. And I'm using this purposefully, the term game, which of course it's not. It's not a game. It's dramatic and deadly on the ground. So all of this is rather fluid. There's a lot of questions to be asked about this. And then even in this debate, it's not even very clear what we mean when we're talking about lethal autonomous weapon systems, because the very notion of autonomy is actually one that you'll find, I guess, at least 100 papers on it in the philosophical literature. What do we really mean? So the way it's usually described has to do with independence. It's independent from human intervention. But if you're an extreme, let's say, I don't know, humanist maybe, you could say that really what this is, it's about a sense of willingness. It's about volition. It is something that is endorsed by the self. But then, of course, we are in a realm where probably no technical system fulfills that criteria. So I think there is a real debate to be had about what precisely do we mean when we talk about this. For many, I think what makes lethal autonomous weapon systems an important topic to talk about is the combination of two things. One is the fact that they make decisions, and they combine this with making action. So it's decision-making plus the action. And I think Phalanx is actually a very good example that was briefly mentioned. It's described as a rapid-fire, computer-controlled, radar-guided gun system to defeat anti-ship missiles. And what it does is, it has been briefly mentioned, what it automatically carries out search, detection, threat evaluation, tracking, engagement, and kill assessment. And it is mostly used in anti-ship missile scenarios. And the reason why it's used is that these attacks have become so fast that basically only automated systems can react to it. Yeah? So I think this is quite an important notion here, because it's one of the main pro-arguments for having lethal autonomous weapon systems, is only by the use of a system that is at least partially autonomous, or let's say automatic, can we be successful in defending ourselves against that missile attack. And this is important to know. I think, however, already the decision-making part is really important. So even if we do not combine decision-making with action, there is a lot to be asked about how these decisions come about. So, and I'll come back to this if we have time, that decision-making about where to attack, how to attack, when to attack, carries probably, at least for me, 80% of the ethical aspects already. So I was asked to very briefly go through some of the arguments, or I'll try to do that, and review some of the arguments in this debate, which I would also probably like to assess as, from a philosophical perspective, not being overly deep. So if there are any philosophers out there, there's still a lot of work to be done in this. A lot of focus, as it was mentioned, is on non-combatant immunity. So it's about civilians that come under attack and under threat through lethal autonomous systems, but there are many other arguments out there. And I'd like to classify them in as follows. So there's one large group of arguments which are foundationally philosophical. And I think the International Committee of the Red Cross has already pointed this out in a very good paper. It's a relatively old paper, that these deeper philosophical arguments, they are really completely independent of the technology. They also they don't depend on the context in which it's made. And I think this is quite important. So this is one large set of arguments. And then there is those arguments, I would say, which are more context dependent, such as the one I've just given, the phalanx system. The phalanx system makes a case basically saying, look, this is a defensive system, why should we not defend ourselves? And this is a situational argument. Then we have points which are more related to technology, which are mostly about precision, but also perhaps about explanation, about understanding what's going on. They are also risk related. And then there are some consequential arguments, which you could call them political also, which is, for example, that lethal autonomous weapon systems have a tendency to lower the threshold for going to war. I'm not sure this is really an ethical argument, but I think it's an important argument. And then there are the pro-arguers, which say we need lethal autonomous weapon systems. And if I had a recommendation to the diplomats, I'd say focus on those, because those are really the important ones. And you need to understand those. I think they come from two sides. One side is that they say what we are debating in international humanitarian law is to some extent outdated, or it's at least unrealistic. Our description of how war is happening is different from what is really happening now. So it's a little bit an outdating argument, and I'll come back to that. And the other one is about precision and situational aspects, and saying we really need them to have them in this situation. So very quickly, let me give some examples of those arguments. So the foundation blocks, the main philosophical ones. So the biggest one is about human dignity, of course. And this, of course, asks the question, which is not at all outcome related. So we are not, for the philosophers in the room, we are not in a consequentialist ethics debate. We are in deontology. And it just says autonomous weapons are in principle incommensurate with human dignity. A machine cannot decide on killing humans. That's the formulation Nolan Sharkey has chosen. And of course, it's a result of a tendency and a history of increasing the distance when in the process of targeting someone, from the sword to now an autonomous drone, where basically it becomes a kind of computer game. Some have argued, I think it's also a very foundational philosophical argument, that an interpersonal relationship between the one pressing the button and the one being attacked needs to be established. If we do not have an interpersonal relationship that is incommensurate again with human dignity, and the reason is that moral decisions are inherently personal. If you have your grandmother in the hospital and the question arises whether to switch off life support, you can ask the doctor, but you cannot, the doctor will not decide for you. It'll be your very decision. This decision cannot be delegated. So moral decisions are inherently related to the person. They are inherently personal. That's different from solving a mathematical equation where I can ask my math teacher. Now, this implies maybe, let's say, a second level of arguments which are more in the direction of human agency. So there needs to be a human. There should be a human decision. There should be human accountability and responsibility. It was already mentioned. And the ICRC, the Red Cross, has argued for, as it was quoted, meaningful, effective, appropriate human control. And that, of course, connects intent with the consequences. That's really what's there. So there's philosophically someone with his intent accepting and actually intending the consequences. That's what it's about. But what meaningful human control really means is up for debate. And obviously, so for example, it has to do with time to some extent. If I fire an artillery shell, then it takes seconds for this shell to reach its target. And we cannot reasonably ask, because it's possible to change our mind after we have fired the artillery shell. And when pulling the trigger of a gun, it takes milliseconds. But when I fire a drone, suddenly I'm in the realm of minutes, maybe hours. And somehow this changes our perception. So temporality apparently plays a role here, which I think is really insufficiently discussed. To some extent, I think much of the worry about lethal autonomous systems also arises from this targeting a single person, taking out a single person, which of course in war can be acceptable. But I would like to make the point that perhaps we are facing a different situation here. Perhaps, as we have seen in ongoing crisis, suddenly if you identify not just a single person, a single combatant that you take out, but maybe hundreds or even thousands, and if you accept the fact that you include low ranks in your decision to take them out, and if you accept low or maybe not so low number of civilians being killed in this process, there is a change in quality that arises from this, from the quantity, basically. I think that's very hard for legal people to grasp because that's usually not within their what they're doing. But there may be a change in the quality of what we're doing once we are delegating decisions in practice to machines. Because again, time is a big factor. If you want to identify 10,000 individual targets, the only way you can do this is by using a machine. And if the machine suggests it, we know we are in the area of bias. If nothing else, we're in the area of technical bias, computer bias, that people trust machines more than something else. Let me just very briefly mention some of the other concerns. So moral responsibility, I've already mentioned. It's not the legal question, it's really this idea question of who's morally responsible. And then there are the more technical concerns like transparency, predictability, reliability, and risk. It should be no surprise that once we have an autonomous weapon system, we will be more surprised by its actions, because that's the whole idea. The whole idea is that there is a certain autonomy. And now it depends on how you estimate what will be happening. Is it more targeted in the sense that we can be safer about what it does? or is it less targeted because there is a surprise and there is a degree to which we cannot fully understand what's going on, especially when there's machine learning involved, and there are very fundamental questions to be raised about it. Sometimes this is called the alignment problem or the King Midas problem, that the system learns what and does what probably we have not anticipated that it should do. I mentioned the longer-term military arguments, such as laws maybe lowering the threshold of going to war. They have an effect of delocalization, meaning where wars used to be, at least in a certain area, or at least the front line was well defined. This is no longer the case. We're going anywhere, and autonomous systems may further extend that trend. There may be an increased likelihood of states to feel tempted to attack other states with autonomous weapon systems, because already now it seems easier to send a drone than a fighter jet with someone in it. So there's all these arguments, and let me just finish with two pro arguments from the side of those who believe we need those systems. So a very deep philosophical argument comes from those who believe in a deontological ethics, consequentialist ethics rather than a deontological one, who think it's only about the outcomes, it's only about the results. If it's only about the results, you might argue there may be a situation where we have the duty to use autonomous weapons if they are more precise, if the war turns out to be more humane, then actually not only should we be allowed to use them, but we may have to use them. There's a whole sub-debate which can be summarized under the robots don't rape argument, which is precisely about what it says. It says robots may be bad and bad systems, and they are, of course, killing, but at least there are some things that they don't do, either because they cannot do them, or we could theoretically program them not to do those things. And there's a whole, also I would say philosophically not extremely high quality, but there's a whole debate about this robots don't rape argument. And maybe perhaps easier to understand is the argument from the case of city war, where basically today we don't have the technical means to really conquer a city that is defended by an evil army that does evil things, other than basically destroying the city. Or being in possession of a very, very large army that does that. And some have argued that only autonomous systems could even hope to conquer such a city with minimum effect on the civilian population, on the infrastructure, and on the own army. I think I'll stop there, and I hope I've summarized a lot of the positions that are relevant for the debate.
Thank you very much. Extremely fascinating thoughts, and thank you for framing the ethical issues. And we've just seen how complex these is. And that's, I think, precisely the reason why we need to broaden the debate from, outside the military, outside the disarmament box. We need to have a whole of society discussion on where do we draw the line in view of the risks. But also you say also the potential for, I'm not saying good, but to have a really informed decision on where we want to take society and humanity forward. Now, I take great pleasure in introducing Anja Kaspersen. Anja is currently the Director for Global Markets Development at IEEE, as already said, the world's largest professional association that focuses on technology. She oversees a myriad of initiatives in relation to technology and AI governance and standards development, including initiatives on the ethics of autonomous and intelligent systems, and the research group on issues of autonomy, AI for defense system. She's also a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, leading the AI and Equality Initiative. She had previously held several senior level positions at UNODA, the Office of Disarmament Affairs of the United Nations, ICRC, the International Committee on the Red Cross, the World Economic Forum. She's been working in academia, and she also worked as a Norwegian diplomat. Now, when I asked Anja how best to introduce her, she said, well, just say, I did stuff. Well, I think it's quite impressive stuff, Anja. So we're really happy to have you, and I thank you. I already said that I'm a big fan of Alexander because his credentials are so impressive in this field. But Anja, you're also extremely impressive. And I stop here because I've already outed me as a groupie of Alexander. AI as being a socio-technical issue and the urgent need to tie also the technical communities in. What is your take on these issues from your perspective, given that you have such deep disarmament experience, but also so invested in the technology side of it? So where's the take from the technical communities?
Well, thank you. Can you hear me okay? It's clear?
I can hear you wonderfully.
Great. So thank you so much, Claudia, Alceus, Ambassador Knepp, for that very generous introduction. I think everyone in this room can probably recognize, I think, especially when we talk about technology and AI, is that the reason why I said I'd done stuff is that the more you work and the deeper you go, the more you know you don't know. So I think the humility comes with the expanse of domains that we work across, right? So certainly for myself, I think that's where I'm at. I think I'm probably more aware of everything I don't know and the questions that need to be asked now than I have been previously in my career. And not least, as you know, the previous speakers alluded to, because AI, and I will get to the IEEE part in a second, but AI challenges something much deeper to where we are technologically, or what happens, you know, to the future war and the future of militaries. But it challenged something deep and profound with what it means to be human. How do we sit with the discomfort of everything we don't know? How do we sit with the ethical conundrums that these, I would say, opportunities offers to us, but they're opportunities that often come with a price tag that may not be communicated as clearly as they should. And this goes to, you know, to your point, Claudia, to really take this outside of the classical arms control domain. And I really agree with your approach in doing so, not to say that arms control is not important, but who are the actors in the arms control space? What type of mechanisms, what type of dialogues need to be in place to do the confidence building measures that arms control and non-proliferation have relied upon for decades, and has been instrumental in getting some of the big treaties and the big instruments in place, especially as those very same instruments are being challenged almost daily by other geopolitical dynamics in force, and forces that are, of course, then triggered both by what is happening in technology, but also the perceptions of what is happening in technology and the deterrent effect that it may or may not provide us. So I also want to say just a thank you to all of you, the ministry, to Ambassador Knepp, you know, for organizing this talk. And also thank you for recognizing the IEEE in playing the role that we have been playing for some time now in the global discourse and the trajectory of AI developments. We are indeed, as you said, the largest technical communities, that I often say the largest community that often people don't know of. We are almost 500,000 engineers and scientists working across every single domain of technology. It was founded 140 years ago by Thomas Edison and, you know, all of his compatriots. We so often say, like, you know, to shed light on stuff, you know, for no coincidence, you know, that the people that were involved in creating electricity was involved in the foundation of it. And we had a unique position for all these years, focusing on two specific things: how to make sure that these technologies are interoperable, which is one of the core issues of standard setting, interconnected and interoperable, and how can they be deployed safely? So what are the metrics, the mechanisms, the instruments that allows us to deploy something safely, develop and deploy something safely? So one of our key, you know, activities is, of course, that what we call conformity assessments, conformity work, which involves standards, verification, validation, certification, life cycle assessments. These are all words that are increasingly becoming embedded into any discourse on AI, I think particularly in the military defense application domain. So while our work is not focused on military applications, because we are an industry organization more than anything else, focusing, as you said, on social technical standards as well, the standards and principles we develop are relevant also in the military sector. And this is one of the points that we've been trying to push and saying, you know, especially with efforts going on to exempt military applications and defense applications, you know, from the larger debate. Our argument has been to say that, you know, these are fundamentally, in most cases, commercial applications that should be subjected to strong industry standards that entails a strong conformity approach. And therefore, the military applications falls under that. So there's a lot to be learned from the commercial side, from the industry side, in both how you develop standards, but also how you integrate standards into both the operational but also normative frameworks. And I think this is particularly relevant when we're looking at issues such as non-proliferation and confidence building measures. So now to your question, I think there's a broad recognition in the technical community that global governance on AI issues is pivotal. Some would say that we are already falling behind the curve. Others, like me, are somewhat more cautiously optimistic that we are moving in the right direction on this. Question is, are we moving fast enough and asking the right questions along the way? Are we having the right people involved? You know, how much is the regular, you know, sort of the corporate narrative being able to dominate these type of discussions? How much are what we call the hyped up narratives of the promises that these technologies have and the capabilities that they promise being able to dominate how we engage with these issues? So there's a lot that challenges our kind of normative approaches to these issues, because there is still a shortage of knowledge and understanding. And this is kind of where we also hoping, and I think our efforts on a daily basis is also try to bridge, you know, some of those, build some bridges on some of those issues, how to do better translation, how to allow that. And I include diplomats in this group because I think as we talk about global governance, there's hardly a group that I've seen work more tirelessly and is more pivotal to the efforts of global governance than diplomats. But they're often kept outside of the more technical conversations, and thus not being able to ask those questions that needs to be asked in these spaces, you know, to set the right standards, to set the right parameters for how we discuss it. So Claudia mentioned my backgrounds. I used to be in disarmament. If I take off my IEEE hat for a little bit, and we had an issue, some of you may recall this, you know, of trying to get the Conference on Disarmament, so the ultimate, the ultimate kind of instrument to run some of the treaty discussions, you know, on arms control, back to work, because they hadn't been able to agree on a program of work for a long time, etc. And without going into the details on the Conference on Disarmament, I had some interesting discussions with people that had used to be very active in this domain decades ago. So when I started getting involved in arms control, and trying to really pinpoint what exactly allowed us to work so effortlessly. And I say effortlessly with great humility and respect, because nothing you do in arms control is ever effortlessly, and it takes time. Anyone who's been involved in this space knows that treaties don't happen overnight. It takes time. It takes a lot of confidence building, etc. And one of the game-changing part of it, which people are telling me, is like, well, we had very strong scientific collaboration. We had engineers and scientists involved in the actual deliberations of these treaties to allow us to make, you know, to come to terms with some of the conceptual issues, with some of the technical issues, with some of the differences, because, you know, technology, as in any other domain, sometimes use the same word, but they mean very different things. Sometimes you measure things differently, you talk about things differently, your local regulations might, you know, be very different from that of another countries. You need to be able to bridge those spaces as well. And so that was very much part of what allowed us to have some, and us as a global community, to have some of those breakthroughs in arms control, was to have that parallel scientific and technological dialogue that underpinned diplomatic efforts. And then for a variety of reasons, that side of it diminished over time. And I think this is definitely the time where that needs to be reinforced again, you know, to have those dialogues, you know, on the sideline. So just to say a few words about, so going back to my IEEE role, you know, we have been instrumental in running a global initiative. So the first one, it was a pioneer at that time. Now I think there's, you know, one would say like an inflation of initiatives on ethics and AI, which is a good thing overall. But we were one of the first ones to start really looking at, okay, what would such social technical standards look like? So we created something called the Global Initiative on Ethically Aligned Design. And the principle of this was very much that if you don't do it by design, safety by design, ethics by design, you're fighting a lost battle, pun intended. You have to start with the conception of thinking about how do I embed those ethical considerations that others have spoken about? How do I embed a safety first principle? How do I think about demonstrated beneficial uses as a requirement for doing what we want to do? So not just taking the risk approach that has become very popularized since, of looking at it after the fact and then trying to regulate it, but really try to embed this, from the early conception of the engineering of the systems, because that's fundamentally what IEEE is. It's a collective of brilliant minds in engineering and science. So these standards, we call them the P7000 family of standards, complemented what's called P2000 family of standards. And I'm saying those numbers because people can Google them. And the 7,000, which is very unique for a family of standards, which are usually, something you would purchase, in kind of an industry application process, are made free for everyone to view under a common Creative Commons licensing arrangement. And they cover everything from how do you embed these kind of ethical considerations in building a system. There have issues around transparency and data privacy and algorithmic bias that was mentioned before. How do we protect, special vulnerable groups like children? Age-appropriate design. How does the age actually get embedded into design and not regulating after the fact? Employer data, when these systems are being embedded into public functions. How do we make sure that the public procurement side of it, is fully immersed, in the considerations that needs to be made. It needs to be put in place. And then you have issues around ontology. And you might have seen that, I think it was Brazil that have submitted a paper where they refer to one of our standards, which is the ontological standard for ethically driven robotics and automation systems, P7007. And reason why I'm mentioning these standards is that for a group of diplomats, and I know this having served as a diplomat myself, the standards world is a rather, unknown community. Why would standards be relevant to me? Why would I even look at these stuff that Anya is now referring to? Because there's two ways of looking at it. Standards is how, like I said, how we're making sure that we have interoperability and interconnectivity and safety embedded into the industry design of systems. But as a diplomat, it can also serve as a very important reference framework of understanding issues, of providing definitional clarity, to help with the normative deliberations, to help set the tone of conversations, because a lot of work goes into it, and a lot of work goes into the how and the why and the who. So not just on the what, but the other questions that also needs to be asked. So it's helpful both in the substantive and the technical domain. And if I go then to the topic of today, so the military side of things, I should mention that you referred to it, Claudia, that in 2018, we did establish a work that was very much inspired by what was happening then in the CCW context and the early phases of the UN General Assembly also discussing this. And of course, Austria pushed, last year to get a resolution through the General Assembly has been instrumental. There's been many efforts that come out of it. I saw today that Austria will be playing a role in a new collaboration, taking a particular responsibility for oversight, which is of course a very important issue in general for industry applications, embedding AI into them. But we established a industry connections group, that's what we call them, which is an independent group of experts on AI in defense applications, which of course is a testament to our commitment as a public organization to see how can our cross-industry engagement and best practices and insights be embedded into the wider discussion of these issues. So we are about to launch, or this group, this independent group is about to launch a life cycle assessment tool to be able to look at the full life cycle when an AI is being conceived of and embedded into a defense application that takes it through from conception to essentially decommissioning. And so this is it's the first one of its kind, and it's technical, but it also offers a lot of insights for anyone trying to operate, of course, in the arms control and non-proliferation space on these issues. And it was born out of the recognition that there is a convergence between the commercial and military applications, and that one shouldn't shy away from recognizing that and then trying to understand how and what can we emulate and bring forward. So I'm happy to also I also have a background from from more the military future war domain. So of course I have some strong views of what is actually happening in the war fighting domain, but I think I'll save that, Claudia, for later when we have Q&As if anyone wants to dig into that deeper. So thank you so much again.
Insightful glimpse into your work and into the technical community's views on this. As you already said, we need to sort of get back to this broader discussion where the scientists and the diplomats and different groups work together on the optimal outcome. And I'm very happy the way you phrased it, the importance of diplomats being part of technology governance. And I think this trend is reinforcing. I mean, that's exactly the reason why the Austrian Foreign Ministry is doing tech diplomacy, trying to enhance our capacities in this field, and not only in the field of AI, but quantum, 5G, 6G, biotechnologies, and whatnot. Now, for everyone, a deep breath. That was quite a lot of information from the legal, technical point of view, from the standards. And I really want to drive home that point again, Anja. Standards have become political. Standards have become geopolitical. Everybody who's been working in the ITU and some proposals that come from different parts understand the geopolitical dimension of it. So we diplomats need to get into this business. Although it's technical and not our cup of tea, it's not about the technologies. I think we need to just, add our expertise and our understanding to these very complex issues. So deep breath. This is now the time for everyone to dig deeper, to ask questions. And please, for those that are in the room, just raise your hands. Someone will come around and give you the mic. Please be so kind, introduce yourself. And secondly, for those who are online, you also have the possibility to put your questions in the chat. We're going to collect them and read them out, or just raise your virtual hand and we'll put you through. We don't have that much time. We spent already a lot of time on presentation, but I'd say it's now 15:20. We still, I'd say, have another half hour, depending on how long you want to stay around, 20, 25 minutes, let's say. So the floor is now open for any questions you have, online and offline. And I give you a couple of minutes to digest. And if there are no questions, I'm ready to shoot off a couple. Do we have anything online? No hands up?
Not yet.
Can we go more to
the question for information? How? Wertender Theorie, information question. How far is this regulation work you are doing? Are there concrete proposals? Are there international committees? Let's say, looking at AI, you have the European AI Act, you have a specific approach. In your field, how far is it? Is it the early beginning? Is it lost in ethical thinking, or do you have some concrete outcomes already?
Who would like to answer that question? Elisabeth or Anja, we've been around for quite some time.
Yes, so the current state of affairs is that the discussions have been ongoing for actually almost a decade now. And so the main process took place in Geneva. So we have the Convention on Conventional Weapons, so the Framework Convention, which regulates and prohibits certain types of weapons. It consists of currently 5 protocols, and there is this discussion whether there should be another protocol explicitly prohibiting on a legally binding basis autonomous weapon systems. But this process is not, there are no official negotiations so far. It is a conversation about possible outcomes for regulation. So it's really out in the open. And what we could see in the last couple of years, mainly because of certain, well, geopolitical changes and rivalries, is that the GGE process has been very slow and very tiring. And so there have been voices in academia and in NGOs and civil society representatives to really, well, shift the focus to different fora. And what you have mentioned is the European Union, which can, of course, more or less only regulate the civilian area, which also might have at least indirect effects. We have the European Defence Fund, which also says we're only going to finance projects defense projects where humans retain control. And we have different fora, such as the General Assembly, which has adopted a resolution, the Human Rights Council, but these approaches or these documents are hitherto non-legally binding. And what we are really looking forward to is finally maybe agreeing on a legally binding regulation of autonomous weapon systems. But the GGE, so in the form of a legally binding protocol, seems to be very challenging, which is why some stakeholders say, well, let's outsource the process and have maybe a standalone legally binding international law treaty that regulates autonomous weapon systems. But that's just something for the future. So we don't have any official negotiations in any kind whatsoever so far, but hopes are high. But given the geopolitical background, it might not be a regulation with all states that are on board, especially non-military power players.
If I can add a few points, it's a really hard problem. First, the pace of technology is, as you know, extremely fast. So when this debate started, we didn't have some of those systems that we talked about, but now they are actually on the market. Now there are some amazing, whatever you think about it, systems that identify people that can distinguish between having a gun in their hand or not, or recognizing minors, for example. So all of this theoretical debate is now becoming also technically feasible. The second point is that when you think about arms control, a lot of it is about counting systems or limiting systems. And here we are talking, for the most part, about software. The drone that is autonomous will not be much different from the one that's not autonomous by the looks of it. It's really about the software. And so that raises also a lot of questions about controlling it and how to check it, how to verify it. Which doesn't make it impossible. It just means you really need to think about what you're doing there. And there was one point that I cannot remember.
It will come. Maybe I should just add from a Austrian foreign ministry perspective, and Anja, I give you the floor in a minute. This is precisely why the Austrian foreign ministry is organizing this conference. To instill more momentum in this debate, because we are convinced we need legally binding regulation for these systems. And as has been said, also the window is closing. So the urgency is really extremely high, because the pace, and Ambassador mentioned this in his speech, the technology, the pace of technology development is extremely high, probably never been quicker and faster and more transformative than ever before. And we need to take action now. And it's true, the difficulty, it is more difficult with software, but I think that's why Elisabeth mentioned it. The approach should be rather a technology neutral one. You focus on human control, and that's a different story. So Anja, please. Do add to that question.
No, I was, so the question from the floor, which is of course a very good one, but it started with, are we lost in ethical thinking? And, you know, as someone who spends their time on this, I will say we never, ever lost in ethical thinking. It's actually what helps us advance as societies, as communities in every domain. And I think it's more important than ever. And I go to a lot of, you know, meetings, and ethics, of course, is an issue in every single one of them. And I say this, also because I know a lot of those listening in, both in the room and on the phone, are diplomats. And, we're used to engaging with ethics in different ways. We all train in ethics and we have different perspectives on it. But in the domain of AI, in the domain of, like you said, Claudia, the variety of technological changes, and AI is maybe one of those technologies that allows all of the other fields also to converge in areas and ways that we are not quite prepared for as diplomats, as people. And some of the arms control instruments are being challenged as well, because we're used to dealing with these as technology by technology, system by system. And all of a sudden you have this new technology that cuts across all of it. So can you create a regulation that specifically targets that? Or do you have to undo and kind of open the can of worms, if I may say so, on all the other ones? And how will this be impacted? Are the convergences that are not being covered in this? So to me, and I often say this, forget about whatever you learned in school about the different framings of ethics. In the context of technology is the way that helps you grapple with tension points and trade-offs, which are inevitably going to be many of when you're talking about AI. I think it's an important thing to understand, and I get to the governance piece in a second, is that these systems, they're not, they do correlations, they don't do causality. And often we relate to them in ways that assumes a certain causality. And that's a big danger of it. So often when I get asked, what do you worry about, what keeps you up at night? My answer is a bit like Stanley Kubrick after Dr. Strangelove in the 60s, when he was asked whether he was worried about the nuclear catastrophe. He said, no, I think human hubris is going to kill us all. And I am deeply worried about the human hubris aspect of things, because there is the lack of understanding, and yet the projections onto this technology is quite mind-boggling sometimes. And a lot is, of course, driven by certain corporate narratives that behooves issues from a revenue-based line and from a market dominance type of perspective. But it's important to grapple with it, but also grapple in the military context as an added dimension, which is that they are displaying elements of reasoning, not reasoning the way that we're used to thinking of it, not intelligence the way that we're used to thinking of it, but something completely different to us. So using these technologies, using AI to run scenarios, for battlefield deployment, etc., present certain challenges that those scenarios being presented may not at all reflect the extensions of, the human paradigms. It may not be, helpful in the same, in the way that we would like it to be helpful. So it's something to reckon with. This is something different to us because we spend a lot of time to understand what is similar to us. But I think a more helpful way is to understand what is different to us and then comment it from that point of view. Now to the regulatory thing, I think it's important to separate, with the various efforts going on. So you have international organizations involved. We know the UN Secretary General is highly involved in all of this, trying to push ahead on issues. We have regional organization efforts, the EU being one example, but also the African Union, the ASEAN, the CARICOM, other regions are pushing ahead on regulations in these issues. Then you have local efforts, there's a lot of focus on local sandboxing and local innovation hubs, also trying to push ahead on this. There are treaty efforts, as Elizabeth referred to, which is separate from the international organizations, but nevertheless, very consistent efforts. The formal efforts in the treaty space on this specific issue, actually, interestingly enough, when you look at the history, started back in 1925, but the formal efforts in the CCW context only started in 2017. That's when it went from an informal dialogue, to more of a formal dialogue on these issues, which also fundamentally changed the topic of discussions, moving more from a agency perspective, more into the operational dynamics and the mission command perspectives of what these technologies were representing, for the future of war. And then, of course, you have the multilateral efforts, the constellation of countries coming together. And then you have industry efforts, the constellation of industry partners coming together. And every single one of these, efforts, somehow builds on each other, they relate, but they offer different perspectives. So I don't think the answer will ever be there will be one massive effort. So global governance will be fragmented, and maybe that's a good thing. But in all of these things, it is very important, Claudia said about my background, and I was asked once, what's my secret to navigating all of these areas? And I mentioned the word hubris before, and I said half an hour every day when I finish work, I check in on my own hubris. What did I learn today that I thought, that basically challenges everything I thought I knew as I entered into this day? And I think that's what grappling with these issues does to all of us. We have to check in on what we know, how we gain that knowledge, what we think we can deduce and surmise from it, and where we move forward from it. Because I think Elizabeth mentioned, the disinformation, misinformation dimensions of these capabilities as well. We are facing some challenging times, but I'm cautiously optimistic that as a collective, we'll be able to manage it.
Thank you so much, Anja. I have Martin Krüger, a former disarmament colleague from the Austrian Foreign Ministry, currently posted in The Hague, also quite an important disarmament hub. Martin, you'd like
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
We can.
That is great. I always have a doubt about my intelligence dealing with these video conferences. Thank you very much for these very thought-provoking presentations. And I think it takes at least 1 or 2 days to digest all the information. I have 2 questions, and maybe they're a little bit basic. First of all, I want to know, or would like to know, what is the difference, or is there a difference between algorithm and artificial intelligence? Like, for instance, if you go on YouTube and you have your searches, and then you will get propositions according to your search history. So is artificial intelligence something going beyond algorithm, or is it a gradual thing, or how would you say that? That is question number 1. Question number 2 is a philosophical question. Free will and the mind-body problem has caused a lot of discussion in philosophy. And of course, now in law, we have to assume that to a certain degree, a normal person that is not incapacitated has a free will and can either commit a crime or refrain from committing a crime. So in putting that in perspective, what is the angle to apply to artificial intelligence and to drone warfare, and the topic of the conference, for which I want to wish you very good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Over to Erich.
Thank you. Thanks for 2 very hard questions that can keep hundreds of philosophers busy for a decade or a century. So the first one is a bit easier, the definition of artificial intelligence. There have been various approaches and to separate it from algorithm, but really some have argued that artificial intelligence is a marketing term. Because in the end, of course, it's all algorithms. It's about, it can be mapped onto, in most cases, at least on a Turing machine, on an automaton, even when it learns, because basically in the end we are using von Neumann architectures for the most part for learning our systems. So they are equivalent. But of course, the point that people, when they emphasize AI, that they're trying to make is that there is some human-like or at least animal-like behavior, such as learning involved, or such as the competence to speak, or such as the competence to recognize images, and to do reasoning and think about those things. So then there is this rather not very productive explanation of intelligence that says, well, if you would call it intelligent when a human does it, then you should call it intelligence when a computer does it. So, which is in the end a behavioral argument. So I think the distinction is difficult. In practice, I think most of AI systems nowadays involve an aspect of learning, but there is also a large group of more traditional AI systems that are really rule-based, that work with more traditional logical methods, and I think we shouldn't forget about them. They are quite important, as for example, they can be easier to be explained. So that's what I would classify. I would probably, if you press me, I would give you a list and then say these are the areas that are covered traditionally in AI, and that makes it different from, I don't know, web research or internet programming. So, but let's not forget it's also a marketing hype. And the second argument, the mind-body problem, well, I won't go there because this is just too much, to be honest, and I'm not interested in it because it's too difficult for me. But I think a practical way of thinking about it, and in this sense, you have already half provided the answer, is what would the consequences be if we would not think about it in the way that we have been traditionally thinking about it? So what would the consequences be if we think everybody's just a machine and there is no free will and we cannot influence people? And would that change, for example, our legal behavior? And I think it probably would. We would have to act completely differently. And so I think I would make the more practical argument that it is actually, at least for people, it's a very good assumption to have. It's one that also avoids a lot of misbehavior, of misclassification of people, assuming that they have a free will, that they have emotions, that they have conscience. I think is a relatively safe assumption, even if I may be wrong in thinking about myself in the end that I have all those things. So that's the kind of answer. And I don't think we have machines that are even close to anywhere there. So.
I have Elizabeth and Anya, who then also likes to comment. Yeah, just maybe 2 or 3 additional points. So I think as a diplomat, but also as a researcher, it's always very important to bear in mind that, of course, the term artificial intelligence is so far from new. On the contrary, it's been deployed since the 1950s, where artificial intelligence was mainly equated with the classical algorithm, and especially over time it changed. And when we talk about AI nowadays, as my colleague has already mentioned, we primarily refer to machine learning in a broader sense. And this is what has changed. So I totally agree that artificial intelligence very often is used to refer to new, to novel, emerging technology. But in the end, the term and research on it has been undertaken for decades. When we come back to the discussion about autonomous weapon systems, it is very important also to just bear in mind that we have not only machine learning, but then also a subcategory, which is basically using deep neural networks to mimic the human brain. And this is where everything becomes very tricky and very complex, because mimicking the human brain requires a lot of computing power on the one hand, but it's also very complex and impossible actually to really understand how a system, a software has reached a decision, has come to a conclusion. And this is when we talk about autonomous weapon systems and the so-called black box phenomenon of AI, it is really important to bear in mind that any kind of software that is based on deep neural networks at the moment is impossible to really explain in a technical, but also in a legal sense. When we talk about explainable AI, we always have to bear in mind it actually would technically mean to decipher these kind of deep neural networks, which can be a huge compound of data, which is unimaginable and actually not really able to cope that and understand that for human brains. So this is just something that I wanted to address. So black box phenomenon and deep neural networks. This is actually what we were talking about. These are the critical issues that we need to address, and which is there are no solutions for it so far, not even from a technical perspective. Sorry. Anya, it's all yours now. You wanted to add on these points.
No, thank you. And I was just thinking from a layman's term and as a former diplomat, just to kind of really kind of take it one level down, the algorithms versus AI. So if you can think of it as like algorithm is the procedural steps to solve a problem, and AI, and it's a bit of a rabbit hole to even try to define the term, as was said, it's a bit of a marketing term, but it's about mimicking. It's about mimicking something that resembles human intelligence to solve those problems. And some of them have been trained, in various ways to then learn from these actions. So trying to define AI is often a bit of a hopeless, task to do in settings like this because of different perspectives on it. And as was said, when the founders of AI as a discipline, it was done by Minsky and others, out of Dartmouth, and it was done very much the name was given to make their grant proposals seem a little bit more, interesting at the time. And then the term has just kind of remained with us since then. But of course, it is a term that describes a whole variety of computational techniques and methodologies. So it's better to actually look at AI as a method, as a methodology, than a technology, which is often something that is often misunderstood as well. It's something being embedded into something else, embedded into a technological application. I'm not even going to try to do the mind-body problem, which is, of course, is a philosophical issue that is as old as humanity itself. But what I will say is that there's one element of warfare which often doesn't get addressed in these type of contexts, and one that is increasingly being recognized, and that is that of cognitive warfare. And I think the disinformation, misinformation that was alluded to earlier is very important to understand that is not warfare is taking a form that is no longer looking at conventional systems, looking at conventional ways of impacting, and this impact could have kinetic effects. If you look at international humanitarian law, you always look for kinetic effect. And when you have cognitive efforts, when your efforts to try to change mindsets that produces kinetic effect, where does that fall in the broad scope of international law? And that's something to be aware of. As I said at the outset, these technologies are not just changing the vectors of the environment we operate within, but they're changing the way we think about ourselves as humans and what we accept within the realm of being human. And I think those are considerations that may be unusual in the context of discussing lethal autonomous weapon systems. But, our readiness and our acceptance of what happens in warfare will be challenged. The more remote we become, do we become more humane or more inhumane? The more remote we become, are we dealing better or less with PTSD? With efficiency that comes from this, are we more likely or less likely to go to war? And with the cognitive capabilities afforded to us, are we likely to go to war differently than we did before? And where are we in our efforts to engage with all of these issues? So, of course, on the technical side are very strong standards in place. And when we say social technical standards, they sort of encompass what I call the distributional impact of these systems. Because that's another important thing, which is also a reflection of the mind-body issue, is that how you experience the impact is going to be different. And that adds something to how the urgency you feel to address these issues, the imperatives that is being felt. And that's why we see a great variation globally on how people engage with these issues. Some regions of the world are more focusing on the risks and the threat side of it. Other regions are more focusing on the innovation, keeping up with industrial development side of it. And the truth is everything, right? It is all of those things. And when you think about national security taken down to very easy components, you're looking at territorial defense and national competitiveness. And AI is going to be instrumental in both domains. And of course, this is going to influence our thinking as well. And the actors are changing fundamentally of who are those who impact on the normative premises of how these technologies are being developed and who is involved. Like who decides, who gets to decide. I wrote an article about that some time ago, but it was very much focused on who's involved in decision-making processes. And so I think fundamentally we need to come back to us. It's a human decision-making process. It's human decisions being emulated and reflected in what we choose to do with the technological tools. But that's fundamentally what it is, and not speak about the technology as something separate from us.
Thank you so much. I think you nailed it very well. I think we have to wrap up. I see Erich who took his mic. Would you like to comment, or shall we quickly wrap up? Because I felt there was a pretty good ending point for our discussion, what Anja said. But I'd like to give everybody of you still a couple of minutes. Let me just thank everyone that you came. Thanks for your patience and your endurance. I think what this discussion shows is particular that the ethical reflection on this helps us, in particular us diplomats, to have a conversation on, what we as a whole want. And I talk this very much from, being an Austrian from the north, looking at my good old friend Alex Wetzig, the ambassador of Chile in Vienna, and we both served at UNESCO, working in particular on the ethics of science technologies. The ethics of AI was a huge thing because we had a global discussion, in particular from the majority countries, who could really feed into where do we as humans want these technologies to go? What makes us human? What is the common denominator? And what are we doing this for? Technology is not an end for itself. We use it for, well, ideally, we would say sustainable, for the achievement of sustainable development. And that's why I think this discussion is so important on ethics, and not so much of the technical or political. That's all important. But as we said, we want to take it out of this very closed special purpose discussion, because this is, of relevance to all of us, not only diplomats, not only scientists or technicians, but a broad societal debate. And now, final last words. Anja, is that okay? You had already wonderful final last words. Do you want to add something on top, or shall we close?
I just want to say one thing: confidence building measures. It's the forgotten art sometimes of arms control and diplomatic art form in general. How the investment in doing confidence building, I can't underline the importance of that enough. And I think standards plays a big role in being able to do that. So that's my end note. Thank you, Claudia.
Thanks so much, Anja. That's a great point. Yeah, would you like?
Yeah, maybe just very briefly. I think it's as I started with this point about being confused, and I think it's okay to be confused. This is a very confusing situation, not just because lethal autonomous weapon systems are difficult to define and the concept of war is changing, also because the players are changing. There was one point I forgot was the development of the technology is not only changing in itself, but it's also driven by private companies. You can build autonomous robots in your garage, basically, for a couple of $100 if you want to, but then there are systems that cost millions. So all of this is hugely complex and comes with, I think, a lot of challenges for traditional diplomatic and arms control debates. But on the other hand, and I think this is where maybe the ethics comes in, on the other hand, we need to focus on what we would like to achieve. And if it's only to say, look here, these are the most terrible things that we do not want to see even in a just war, because that's what we're talking about, and focus on those and say, let's see if we can just eliminate those, and then we talk technically about how we can achieve it. And that may be more productive because of the challenges involved than starting with a legal debate, I think, against lawyers. It's just, I think you shouldn't lose sight of what you really want to achieve. And so I want to encourage you to do that.
Thank you, Erich. Elisabeth.
Yeah, I had some time to think about what I wanted to say as my last words, at least for this presentation today. I just wanted to raise an important issue because I think that every one of us has read the news about what is actually going on with regard to artificial intelligence and armed conflict in various current conflicts. And what we basically can see is, I don't know if you share that opinion or that impression, there seems to be a shift of narrative when it comes to using not only autonomous weapon systems, but maybe unmanned air vehicles in general in international armed conflict. They seem to be accepted realities on the battlefield. Okay, but that holds especially true for Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. But then we see a very different conflict, a non-international, lawyers would say. And when we talk about non-international armed conflict, I see one of the biggest challenges, and I think this is what I would like to address to you now, also as a food for thought. When we have non-international armed conflict, it's really the decision of states who qualifies as enemy fighter, who can be neutralized. Can they be neutralized when they're at home with their families? Is that correct? If they don't have a continuous combat function. It's not only about autonomous weapon systems, it's not only about AI, but it's also about the perception of states as such. How do they want to deal with different kinds of conflicts in the future, which are not only dealing with classical scenarios of international armed conflict, but NIACs, where civilians are more likely to suffer, and where we really need to be aware where we want to go with this as well. So I think these two discussions need to be actually interlinked. Thank you.
Great final words, in particular. Thank you so much for our great panelists. Thank you, Anja. Thank you, Erich. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you also the team and from our both departments, from the disarmament department, from the technology, tech diplomacy department. Thank you to you. Now we still can drink some coffee and have a glass of water. And we're going to come up with another tech diplomacy talk hopefully soon. Hope you'll join in. We're looking into AI and law enforcement, but that's after a while. Thank you so much and have a good day.